The first moment. On a winter's day when snowflakes danced like white butterflies against the windowpane, a beautiful queen sat at her ebony window frame, sewing delicate embroidery. The snow was so pure and white that it seemed to glow with its own light, and the queen paused in her work to admire its beauty. As she watched the falling snow, she accidentally pricked her finger with her needle, and 3 drops of crimson blood fell upon the pristine white snow that had gathered on the black ebony windowsill. The sight was so striking, the red blood against the white snow and the black wood, that the queen was moved to make a wish. She pressed her hand to her heart and whispered, "Oh, how I wish I could have a child as white as snow, as red as blood, and as black as ebony." Her wish was granted. Soon after, she gave birth to a daughter whose skin was as fair as fresh snow, whose lips were as red as ripe cherries, and whose hair was as black as a raven's wing. They named her Snow White, and she was the most beautiful child anyone had ever seen. But joy was short-lived. The good queen, weakened by childbirth, fell ill and died when Snow White was still a baby. The king, heartbroken and lonely, eventually remarried. His new wife was breathtakingly beautiful, but her heart was as cold as winter stone. She possessed a magic mirror that could answer any question with absolute truth, and every morning she would stand before it and ask, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" And the mirror would always reply, "You are the fairest of them all, my queen." This answer pleased the vain queen greatly, for she knew the mirror could not lie. The middle journey. Years passed, and Snow White grew more beautiful with each passing day. On her 7th birthday, when the queen asked her usual question, the mirror gave a different answer. "You are fair, my queen, it's true. But Snow White is fairer than you." The queen's face twisted with rage and jealousy. From that day forward, she could not bear the sight of Snow White, and her hatred grew like a poisonous weed in her heart. When Snow White turned 14, the queen could stand it no longer. She called for her huntsman and commanded him to take Snow White deep into the forest and kill her. "Bring me back her heart as proof," she demanded. The huntsman, though loyal to the queen, could not bring himself to harm the innocent princess. In the depths of the forest, he told Snow White of the queen's wicked plan. "Run away, child," he urged. "Run far from here and never return." He killed a wild boar instead and brought its heart to the queen, who believed Snow White was dead. Lost and frightened, Snow White wandered through the dark forest until she stumbled upon a tiny cottage. Inside, she found 7 little beds, 7 little plates, and 7 little cups, all perfectly arranged. Exhausted, she fell asleep across the 7 beds. When the 7 dwarfs returned from their work in the diamond mines, they found her there. Their names were Doc, Grumpy, Happy, Sleepy, Bashful, Sneezy, and Dopey, and though they were initially startled, they were charmed by Snow White's gentle nature. When she told them her story, they agreed to let her stay in exchange for keeping house while they worked. Meanwhile, the magic mirror eventually revealed the truth to the queen: Snow White still lived. 3 times the queen disguised herself and visited the cottage, each time with a different deadly trick. First, she nearly strangled Snow White with a bodice laced too tight. Then she poisoned a comb and placed it in Snow White's hair. Each time, the dwarfs returned just in time to save her. The 3rd time, the queen came disguised as an old peasant woman selling apples. She offered Snow White a beautiful red apple, keeping the poisoned half for the princess while eating the safe half herself to prove it was harmless. Snow White bit into the apple and immediately fell into a death-like sleep so deep that the dwarfs could not wake her. Heartbroken, the 7 dwarfs could not bear to bury their beloved Snow White. Instead, they placed her in a glass coffin on top of a hill, where they could visit her every day. Even in her deathly sleep, she remained as beautiful as ever, looking as if she were merely dreaming. The last moment. One spring morning, when wildflowers bloomed around Snow White's glass coffin and birds sang sweetly in the trees, a young prince rode through the forest. He had heard tales of the sleeping princess and had traveled far to see if the stories were true. When he beheld Snow White lying in her crystal resting place, he was struck by her ethereal beauty. The morning sun caught her ebony hair, making it shine like silk, and her skin glowed with an inner light. The prince knelt beside the coffin, his heart filled with a love so pure and true that it seemed to make the very air around them shimmer. "She is the most beautiful maiden I have ever seen," he whispered to the dwarfs, who had come to stand vigil as they did every day. "Please, let me take her to my castle, where she can rest in a place of honor. I promise to cherish and protect her always." The dwarfs, seeing the genuine love in the prince's eyes and knowing that their beloved Snow White deserved a resting place worthy of a princess, agreed. As the prince's man lifted the glass coffin, they stumbled slightly on the rocky path. The jarring motion dislodged the piece of poisoned apple that had been stuck in Snow White's throat all these months. Suddenly, Snow White's eyes fluttered open. She sat up in the coffin, alive and more beautiful than ever, looking around in wonder. The prince, overjoyed, helped her from the coffin and told her how he had searched for her. "I felt your presence even in my deepest sleep," Snow White said softly, taking his hand. "It was your love that called me back to life." The seven dwarfs danced with joy, throwing their caps in the air and cheering. They had their beloved Snow White back, and she had found her true love. The prince asked Snow White to marry him, and she joyfully accepted. At their wedding, which was held in the most beautiful cathedral in the kingdom, Snow White wore a gown of white silk that sparkled like snow in sunlight, and a crown of diamonds that caught the light like dewdrops. As she walked down the aisle, Snow White saw the seven dwarfs in the front row, dressed in their finest clothes and beaming with pride. They had become her family, and she had given them a place of honor in her new kingdom. The evil queen, upon learning of Snow White's resurrection and marriage, flew into such a rage that she shattered her magic mirror. In her fury, she aged rapidly and crumbled to dust, her wickedness finally consuming her completely. Snow White and her prince were crowned together, and they ruled their kingdom with wisdom and compassion. The seven dwarfs were given their own wing of the castle, and they remained Snow White's most trusted advisors and dearest friends. On quiet evenings, Snow White would sit by her window, not unlike her mother had done years before, and look out at the falling snow. But instead of making wishes, she would count her blessings, a love as true as her prince's heart, friends as loyal as her seven dwarfs, and a kingdom filled with joy and peace. The princess who had once been as white as snow, as red as blood, and as black as ebony, had become something even more beautiful, a queen whose heart was as pure as fresh snow, whose love was as warm as summer sunshine, and whose wisdom was as enduring as the mountains themselves. The end. And so Snow White lived happily ever after, proving that true beauty comes not from outward appearance alone, but from the kindness, courage, and love that shine from within. In her kingdom, no one was ever judged by their looks, and the magic mirror's cruel questions were replaced by acts of genuine care and compassion for all.